Welcome to Flip Video 5.5. Today we're going to look a little bit more carefully about or at the defining characteristics of modern commercial agriculture. So we're going to take our discussion past just the Green Revolution, which eventually we'll return to when we discuss some of the criticisms of modern agriculture. But today we're just going to focus on the idea of how has modern commercial agriculture changed, and more specifically, how has it made food a truly global experience and um, global good. So let's start off first with the fact that, quite simply, modern commercial agriculture is truly defined by the rise of these large scale commercial operations. So we've got this complete shift away from small family farms, which is not to say they're non existent, but general pattern is that most farms are larger in size, and they're being increasingly owned by large scale operations. These operations are capital intensive, which means they require a lot of money to operate. So this is really getting away from this very stereotypical view of farming in commercialized regions as something done by backwards or perhaps less educated people, when in reality, farming and modern commercial farming is an incredibly scientific process that involves all kinds of industrialized machinery and processes that are quite scientific. So you see in the top right, we've got a crop duster applying just the right amount of pesticides to these crops that are done by air. You see the clearly mechanized version here with in the bottom left the use of I believe these are reapers but that could be wrong, for the agricultural fields. Whole idea here is that modern commercial agriculture is a very, very deliberate process that is intended to maximize the yields using industrialized both technology and mechanisms. So this is a really scientific process and major change that has really defined modern agriculture. Similarly, technology has really changed the economies of scale of agriculture. In other words, how much should we produce to maximize our profit? The improving technology, biotechnology, and transportation means that we really can produce pretty massive amount of food with a lot less input. And that has all kinds of implications. In fact, in the United States, there's many products that we produce too much of, and farmers are those are called subsidies. These farmers are paid subsidies really regardless of whether or not they produce, whether that's being sold. Now, this is a very controversial idea because we need those farmers to continue to produce that good, and farmers have a lot of unreliability. But bottom line, just bring it back here to the idea that we've got this massive new economy of scale that farmers can produce so much more food with this modern commercial and industrialized agriculture than they ever could before, and with significantly less work that was invested than in years past. Really, the key idea here about defining characteristic of modern commercial agriculture is that food is now part of a global supply or commodity chain. What that means is a commodity chain is a process that's used to gather resources, transform them into goods or commodities. That's what a commodity is, something that's a good that can be sold. Transform into goods or commodities, and then finally distribute them to consumers. So this is a process. What this process does is it links the many places of production and distribution, and they all result in a commodity or a good that's exchanged on a world market, not just in a single place. Let's see a visual, then we'll come back. Here is a commodity chain of cocoa pods, right? So here we have is the cocoa pods are harvested from the trees. They're collected in large baskets. They're taken to a curing area where the farmers remove the cocoa beans from their pods. They're fermented. They're dried. The dried cocoa beans are then packed into sacks for transport. The transport beans, and this is specifically in West Africa, these cocoa beans are transported in trucks by road to the Ghanaian port, where they're packed into containers. Remember, we talked about containerization, where the size of the container is uniform to allow this commodity chain to work very effectively. Those container ships transport the cocoa beans by sea to the port of Singapore. Trucks transport the beans. That's called a break of bulk point. Just plant that seed for later when they're transporting from one mode of transportation to another. Trucks transport the cocoa beans to a processing factory. The cocoa mass, the cocoa butter, and cocoa powder are produced in the processing factory. Then they're transported back on trucks, back to the Sea of Melbourne, or to the port by sea to a port of Melbourne. Trucks are transporting the cocoa products from a road to the port of Melbourne to a manufacturing. They use the cocoa products as ingredients. Those ingredients are loaded onto pallets and trucks. Trucks transport the products to a warehouse where orders are assembled. Orders are loaded onto pallets and trucks. Trucks transport the roads to supermarkets and retail outlets. Wow, right? We just covered a massive amount of territory here and an unbelievable number of steps that are linking, let's go back to the commodity chain, the gathering of the resources all the way to that global world market. This is called a commodity chain or a global supply chain. The common trend is that these products are being produced primarily in low latitude LDCs, specifically products like coffee and bananas, and they're experiencing this global commodity chain, and they're being consumed globally, specifically usually in MDCs. So what we see here is that food is no longer this local experience, but this connective global experience that's making all the regions of the world connected to one another and interdependent upon one another. So the general pattern is this production of food from the low latitudes being distributed across the world. So we see I'm going to show you this in class actually, but we can see that that's what I just showed you is the commodity chain of West Africa as being a leader producer of cocoa beans. So as I just said here, food, in other words, food is now a global experience that makes the world more interdependent upon one another. Let's blow up this little bit graphic here. You can see areas of the world, and of course, those are not just the low latitudes, but you see here just the areas of the world that are producing the crops that are being consumed on a global scale. If I wanted to, I could go down to Safeway, or maybe I have to go to Whole Foods, and I could get myself a coconut. Well, coconuts most certainly are not being grown in Washington D.C. If I got coconut milk, let's say, coconut milk would go through this massive same transportation process and manufacturing process, or this global commodity chain. And this is linking, again, the gathering of the resources all the way to the actual consumption of the product. So we've got this many multifaceted step that's really transforming the way that it is that we actually eat and consume food. You can see here this is a web of the global interdependence of products. I like this visual here that we just suddenly, it's no longer the Columbian Exchange began this process of food being a global experience, but in modern day we can eat food from all over the world that's being shipped. And when you look around, and I mean, I'm sitting here in the classroom right now and I'm looking at a train out the window, and that train very likely could be carrying products as part of this global commodity chain that's ensuring that that corner store or the grocery store carries food from all over the world that's been manufactured in different places, that's been transported, that goes to sea. So we've just got this massive global experience. I love this on the bottom left there. It says a single cup of Starbucks coffee can depend upon as many as 19 countries. Between the coffee bean, the milk, the sugar, the paper cup, Starbucks coffee is a global hub that connects some of the poorest countries in the world with some of the wealthiest. Again, coffee being produced in those low latitude regions, but being manufactured or being sold and being consumed primarily by the most developed countries. So really an interesting dependency that's really not all good, that was being created here in the patterns of global food consumption. So now food distribution is not just a matter of you getting in touch and going to a farm, right? That's not how it works. Global food production and distribution now depends on all kinds of factors. Political systems, so the agreement of governments, the availability of infrastructure. So in order to transport those goods, you need refrigeration, you need trucks, you need ports. There's patterns of world trade. So those, as we talked about with political geography, these patterns of free trade. So for example, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Association, that's really going to help dictate some of the food commodity prices and the food trading mechanisms across the Americas. The United Nations helps to organize with the distribution of food. So food, again, is really this global experience, and it's not just about a local experience of getting food from one farm to a specific region that will be fed by that farm. Food distribution also depends on people's tastes. So I mentioned this already, but I'm going to come back to this. China has a very large population. It has a rising middle class, where people are becoming increasingly wealthy. That means this increasingly wealthy population is increasing the demand for red meat in China. So red meat is now, there's a global demand that companies are going to respond to. And what I'm going to ask you to look at is to see the video and the analysis questions. Oh, hold on, announcement.
You need in the main office, Mr. Brown.
Sorry about that. We even see that this has massive implications on a global scale. The fact that Chinese people want to eat more red meat actually led to China buying out one of the largest American pork producers Well, I'm sorry, I should say this differently. This was the red meat piece, but the pork producer known as Smithfield Farms, and you're going to look at a video about that and the global effects that that has when just based upon people's taste and changing preferences. You know this too. I'm such a sucker for this. Food. Think about popular foods. Quinoa, for example, has become very popular as a health food. Almonds is a superfood. Kale, right? All the things that you hear kind of as buzz trends in food, that has massive, massive global implications. The fact that I just had quinoa last night. The fact that I ate quinoa, get that is absolutely a product of someone else, somewhere else in the world producing that increasing demand for quinoa. So you can just can imagine just this visualization here that if here I am in North America wanting more quinoa, how that is really just going to affect a global scale. And I'll come back to that one there. So I kind of like this here. You can see here that formerly what you grew may have been based upon the ecology, the climate, right, the biological factors, or here the farming, the inputs here. But now there's just this entire there's an economic system. The farmers, the people who buy food in bulk, are the wholesalers versus grocery stores versus farmers markets versus restaurants. Looking at the social systems here, so the countries that are involved, regulations that people have to follow in their trading agreements for food. A great example of that is that the European Union does not allow genetically modified organisms to be grown in the EU. So that is an implication because these transnational corporations that make these GMOs have to accommodate this. So the regulations that are placed, the taxes that people make on different types of food, the labeling of food. Another example is that many places want genetically modified food to be labeled. China, the price of corn in China has immediate implications for the price of corn here in the United States. I mean, there's just these massive, massive implications of this web that is now connecting us economically, politically, socially, environmentally to one another, all because of this food. One of the key pieces of that whole process, and I sort of alluded to this a second ago, is that modern agriculture, what is allowing this interconnectedness, is this rise of what's known as agribusiness. So agribusiness, as I already introduced this term to you, are these large scale operations that connect the production of food from the seed all the way to the market. So you can see here, this is a vertically in this visual. It's hard to find good visualizations for this, but I want you to envision one company owning the process all the way from that soy corn bean ingredient that's taken to a feed mill that's brought to a breeder so the chickens can eat that same corn that is to fatten them up. Then you've got those eggs are hatched, those broilers the specific type of chicken. They have a grow house. Those are the ready-made broilers. Then go to the processing plant. They've got the distribution, the retail and distribution at the grocery. Imagine a company who's responsible from the production all the way from the beginning, from the soy plant, all the way through to the sale at market. So we've got this rise of these modern agribusinesses. Some of the key examples, Conagra Foods, Cargill was a huge one. Monsanto, to some extent, would be considered these rise of agribusinesses. So these are very, very large. These are giving names to what I mentioned already about the large-scale commercial operations. Now, not everyone agrees with this, and we're going to have a whole another discussion about some of the responses to this rise of modern agriculture in this way. So just a little bit more specifics about what this looks like as we have these increasing rise of modern agriculture and agribusiness and the increasing interconnectedness of our world's global economy through food. We've got an increasing presence of plantation agriculture. This makes sense. I already said it, that we're producing more of cash crops in these low latitude countries that are being produced in other regions of the world. So we've got the luxury crops. Cash crops, a decent definition would be luxury crops that are in high demand. Luxury meaning that they're sort of a variety here. And they also have to be processed in some way. You can't just pick a coffee bean and eat it. There's a processing to this to that crop. Similarly, sugar grows on sugar cane. You can't just I mean, I guess you could chop down the cane and suck on it, but that's not the same thing to get the sugar. But that's not the same thing as the granulated sugar, the brown sugar that you and I would likely buy at the grocery store. So there's a processing element. So you can see why agribusiness is involved here. You're getting the crop, but there's still this transportation and processing piece to it. So you can kind of think back to this same thing I showed you, this commodity chain I showed you for cocoa beans. And keep going back here. Well, there's the response to this, and I'm just going to initially address this now, and I'll come back to this when we get to the lesson. But there's a large response to this as being unfair to the farmers, and that the fact that this is not being consumed locally disempowers the local people in some ways is an argument. And the argument is that um, there's something called the fair trade movement, which is people eating food that has been guaranteed to um, that has been certified as economically sustainable for both the business and the farmer themselves. Typically, it's a lot more expensive, but it's supposed to be fair trade food is supposed to be a response to this large scale increasing use of plantation agriculture. Modern grain farming has really changed a lot in this modern agriculture, this world of global business, global food. For example, most of the corn and the soybeans, you may not often think about soybeans, but soybeans are one of the the largest production of, or one of the largest most oh tongue tied here commonly produced foods in the United States. So if you look here in the corn belt, corn and soybeans are produced on a massive scale in the United States for several reasons. One, actually, I need to put this up here. Actually, the primary reason that these are grown is actually to feed livestock. And let's just change this here real quick. Feeding livestock. Cows and chickens do not naturally eat corn. They naturally eat grass. But corn and soybeans, both of those, are going to fatten up livestock very quickly. On the whole, the world is eating more and more and more meat. And as we eat more meat, we want to create that meat efficiently. And so creating that meat efficiently means that we feed corn and chickens. We feed chicken and um, oh gosh, cows. Good lord, cows and all other kinds of livestock. We feed them corn to fatten them up quickly. And this concept of a feedlot, I'm going to come right back to. The other main piece here about corn is we're producing specifically corn, not soybeans, to create corn syrup. Corn syrup is sugar that's found in the vast majority of food. If we're talking ketchup, we're talking cereals, we're talking gosh anything. Just there's lots and lots of corn syrup as a sugar substitute, and the corn is being produced to meet that increasing sugar sweet tooth that we Americans and many MDCs increasingly have. It's also used, corn is used specifically to create ethanol. So, ethanol is used in gasoline to produce gasoline because the gasoline, there's increasing fuel standards, there's increasing movement to try to reduce the amount of reliance upon gasoline and to try to make cars more efficient and have less pollution. Well, using corn to create ethanol can then in turn help sort of supplement the existing gasoline to make cars run on less of the oil dependency. So, that's a real evolution of modern agriculture, that we're producing grain in this context, corn and soybeans, for something other than actually eating that specific corn. For example, that the corn that is fed to livestock is not at all the same kind of corn that you and I eat. It's not a corn on the cob. It tastes terrible. From my understanding, I've not actually tasted it. It's specifically meant for animals. So real shift in the fact idea that we're producing goods not actually for human consumption. So here's where you can see the major growing areas for soybeans in the U.S. And here's the quote-unquote corn belt of the United States, where most of the corn is grown. One more piece about the evolution of ranching. In ranching takes up a lot of land, and the increasing demand for meat means that rather than using more and more land for ranching, we're using feedlots. And feedlots are essentially fattening farms. So what this means is that cows are likely taken to a feedlot at the end of their life. So they've been raised, and then they're going to be transported along rail to an area that's a farm that's called a feedlot. And the feedlot is basically just, as you see here, an area, not a lot of it's no grazing. They're again eating corn and soybeans, but the purpose is just to fatten up the cows. And then these feedlots, the cows will then either be this feedlot is located very close to or even within the same area to the area where they're slaughtered and then taken there to market. This minimizes the transportation costs, so that way you're not raising a very large cow far away from the market. That you can raise them when they're young, bring them to the feedlot, fatten them up, slaughter them, and then transport that manufactured goods. So again, you see that commodity chain idea here. So you can see just there's a large scale increase in the number of feedlots, massive booms here with dairy cows, beef cattle, hogs, chickens, all feeding this booming population and are increasing interest in eating meat. All right, that's it, ladies and gentlemen. There are your analysis questions for number 3. You have to Google this phrase right there, PBS, who's behind the Chinese takeover of the world's biggest pork producer. You need to actually Google that so that you can watch the video that's on that page. The first thing that comes up will be what you're watching. All right, that's it. See you very soon in class.